11 people murdered for being Jewish, 2 people murdered for being black, more than a dozen people targeted, and a mail bomb spree for their political beliefs. 3 separate sets of crimes in America in 72 hours, with one common denominator: hate, which is on the rise. In fact, the Anti-Defamation League says anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. spiked 57% last year. Joining me now is George Selim. He's the Senior Vice President at the Anti-Defamation League, where he oversees the work of the ADL Center on Extremism. Good to have you with us. When we see this number, it does stop you in your tracks to think that there was a nearly 60% rise in the span of only a year, which begs the question, why?
So there are a few reasons as to why, and I should say, while that number is shocking in some ways, it's not completely surprising. The ADL has been tracking and monitoring all forms of violent extremism for several decades now, and we've seen a precipitous incline in the amount of both anti-Semitic incidents as well as all forms of other extremism manifesting themselves domestically across the country. So while the numbers we see in anti-Semitic spikes in 2017 are in fact shocking, they're not surprising because we've seen this continued uptick.
So where is it? But again, so then where is that uptick coming from?
Really a combination of things. For starters, in the past several years, we've seen a normalization of hate in this country, where extremism of all forms has really entered the main stage. Second, the frequency in which this information is disseminated on social media platforms and alternative social media platforms like Gab that are created for the sole intent and purpose to distribute and convene extremists of all forms to share their ideas and communicate with one another. The normalization of hate, coupled with the speed in which this information is shared on social media, is part of this really combustible mix.
As you know, there's a lot of finger pointing, especially in the wake of what we've seen over the last few days. President Trump is often brought up here, and even some of my guests I was just speaking with earlier point to the president as a source of blame in many cases. Can the president be held accountable for the actions of others?
The reality is that no one person can be held responsible for the heinous acts that were committed in Pittsburgh this past weekend. What's important to note here is that leadership in times of crisis counts. Leaders need to stand up and speak out forcefully against all forms of anti-Semitism, bigotry, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and all forms of bigotry and extremism. Leadership counts at both the federal, state, local, and community levels.
In terms of leadership, we should point out, too, you also worked in the government under Presidents Trump, Obama, and Bush. Was there a difference that you noticed at all in terms of the leadership of those three and their administrations?
I mean, leaders throughout all three administrations that I served in all had different styles. The one thing that I could say is I was fortunate enough at the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice where I worked, where I consistently worked under leaders who stood up and spoke out against all forms of bigotry and extremism. My former boss, Secretary Jay Johnson, was on news this morning, was on news yesterday, talking about efforts that the previous administration took to forcefully speak out against all forms of bigotry and extremism, and I support the work that we did in the previous administration.
I want to ask you about this other statistic, because as disturbing as that 57% rise is over the span of a year, what really took my breath away was this: 90%. That's the increase of some 90% in incidents in K through 12 classrooms. We often look at kids as being this great blank slate and being so accepting and not having formed their bias that may come later in life. But yet there was a 90% increase in incidents among elementary school students. Where is that coming from?
Yeah, Erica, that's such an important point, because as individuals start to talk to solutions and as we start to talk about healing in the aftermath at Pittsburgh, it's not limited to talking about social media companies and content on platforms. It starts really at the kindergarten, elementary school level. You know, at ADL, we work with students and teachers that and institute programs that reach about 2 million students per year, specifically focused on anti-bias, anti-hate programming at the lowest level at elementary schools. And when we talk about modeling behavior, that's why it's so important to talk about leadership. We're asking young people these days to model behavior. And a part of our work that we do when we go into classrooms across the United States is teach young people those critical thinking skills, those skills to stand up and speak out against bigotry and extremism or bullying that they see happening on their schools and on their playgrounds across the country. That's an important part of the solution here moving forward.
George Selim, appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica.